My name is Kim Schaefer, and this is my presentation for our final project. I chose to go over Objective 1. I really like history, and so it's really interesting for me to learn about the history of special education and how that's kind of built on each other to what special education is today. I can get my Okay, so students have not always had the right to special education. If a students had different emotional disabilities, deafness, blindness, any kind of special needs, they usually had to be educated at home, or their parents had to pay for a private educator. So historically, they were normally placed in hospitals, asylums, institutions that could care for them, but really weren't educating them. So before 1961, the United States really didn't publicly educate any children with disabilities. Um, After a push of parents with advocacy groups, they met with teachers and politicians. Lyndon B. Johnson began signing off on acts designed to publicly fund education and really expand public education, including expanding those protections for students with special needs. So, over the years, education has been restructured, it has been reformed, it has been transformed by these different legislations. So, today we have IDEA, or the Individual with Disabilities Education Act, but there was a lot of cases that led up to that. So the first one I wanted to talk about was Brown versus Board of Education. So in 1954, large portions of the United States had racially segregated schools, and this was made legal by Plessy versus Ferguson, the Jim Crow laws, which basically said that public facilities had to be separate but equal. In 1951, Oliver Brown, after his daughter was denied access to a white school, filed a lawsuit saying that the schools for black children were not equal to schools for white children, and several other of these cases popped up. So these were brought to the Supreme Court under the name Brown versus Board of Education at Topeka. Thurgood Marshall kind of led the charge on this, and he argued that the separate but equal didn't work because it violated the Equal Protection Clause, that 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, that basically said that they could not no state shall make or enforce any law which shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So this Brown case really put desegregation at the forefront of education and ended up outlawing segregation based on characteristics that you couldn't change, such as your race or a disability, because it violated that equal protection clause. So it really led the way to a growing understanding that all people have a right to a public education. The civil rights movements of the 50s and 60s had a huge impact on the treatments of individuals with disabilities. Using Brown as a legal precedent, people were starting to be able to argue that the same laws that were saying that discriminating against the race was illegal was also discriminating against disabilities was illegal. So if Brown could not segregate by race, neither could schools segregate. Oh, sorry. Neither could students be segregated by their disability. And one thing I thought was interesting is even though we've come a long way, because at the time of that ruling, you couldn't really find any public school that integrates students with disabilities. And today, 56% of students with intellectual disabilities are still separated in separate classes or separate schools. The next act I wanted to go into was the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. So there was still a huge gap in education for underprivileged children. And with the passage of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act and Lyndon B. Johnson, schools began receiving this federal money for public education. So these funds were supposed to be used for professional development, instructional materials, resources to support educational programs, and the promotion of parental involvement. So this really brought to education to the forefront and started addressing a lot of the issues with education. A year later, this amendment there was an amendment to the law that set aside funds specifically for students with disabilities, and it kind of set up the framework of schools receiving federal funds for special education. And it promoted a lot of the ideas that we find in IDEA today, like free and appropriate public education and an individual education plan. Two cases that popped up in the 70s were Park and Mills. So, Park, or the Pennsylvania Association for Retarded Children, sued Pennsylvania, saying that their law that allowed public schools to deny education to certain children if they had not attained a mental age of 5 years was unlawful. They said that Pennsylvania schools in Pennsylvania were taking advantage of the law because they thought that students with special education would be too much work. So this was the first major challenge to laws across the country, not just in Pennsylvania, um, that were using the law to kind of circumvent having to teach these students with special education. So it was ruled that the state must provide a free and sufficient education for all students. Kind of sparked us going into Mills. So then 1972, Peter Mills and seven other children came before the U.S. District Court. This school that he was fighting against, said they were excluded because the school said his issues would be too expensive to address. And this was a long-standing excuse in education of why they weren't teaching people special needs. They said it was just too costly. So again, the courts ruled in favor of students, and they ordered the exclusion was unlawful. So it really showed that the treatment of um, students with disabilities was something you could fight for in a court and you could win. It really started this wave of people standing up to school districts and trying to use the law to discriminate against students with special needs. It was that idea too that no student should be denied a public education on the basis of the fact that it might cost too much. So, in spite of these landmark decisions, there was still school districts really still tried to circumvent the law. They really tried to say, it was too financially hard, it was too pragmatic, they didn't have the right staffing resources. So, in 1975, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act was passed. So, this formally declared that all schools receiving that federal funding had to provide equal education for those students with special needs. Um, Basically, the act came from, again, a wave of support, building off that civil rights movement, building off all these cases. There were multiple problems following the passage of this act, and the government did struggle to enforce all parts of this act. So it was groundbreaking in what it promised. What was before schools tried to argue was a privilege was now a legal rights for those special educated children to be educated in the public schools. Like I said, there were some problems with it, but it eventually led to a lot of the ideas we see in the Individual Disabilities Education Act today, like the Individual Education Program, a free and appropriate public education, and to be served in the least restrictive environment. So again, we're just continually building towards the act we have today. So in 2004, IDEA was passed, which is the continuation of the Education for All Handicapped Act, and some people might be familiar with the No Child Left Behind Act in 2001. This was all built and came out of that. So society really started going through this change. Basically, is this perspective change. We started seeing people with special needs in our schools. We started seeing them not only in grade school, but graduating high school, going to college, participating in their community. We started seeing them out in our neighborhood because we started having those resources where we could help them succeed. So the Individuals with Disabilities Act was a huge part of that. It really helped set up students for success, and really started promoting that accountability and started having basically a curriculum and some standards that schools were held to make sure that these students were getting educated in the ways they should. So the reauthorization really continued to move the agenda forward as far as accountability and empowerment of parents and students and educators. Like I said, started that standard-based curriculum, a scientifically based instruction, ensuring that they had the best highly qualified teachers, and mandating the use of responses to instructions to determine appropriate interventions to make sure that these students were getting the education they needed. So it's really greatly improved the special education that is provided to students now, and it's opened doors to more students that were previously barred from services, like maybe students with hearing disabilities or visual disabilities. So we've really come a long way. Obviously, it's been a long, hard battle, and it's been going back several decades, but in the past 35 years, have become way more inclusive, and the future of children with disabilities is brighter than ever before. Significant progress has been made since Brown versus or education and before, with protecting the rights of those individuals with special needs, whether it be infants, toddlers, children, youth, adults, and we're only going up from here. So there is my references list, and thank you so much for listening.